Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet opens with two servants of the Capulet household walking along a street in Verona.
You might think they were out for a pleasant stroll, until you notice they're armed with swords and shields.
They soon run into a group of servants from another household, the Montagues, who also happen to be armed.
Verbal insults quickly escalate into sword fighting.
As luck would have it, two young noblemen, one a Capulet, the other a Montague, happen to be in the vicinity and hear the commotion.
They're wearing rapiers, thin fencing swords, and they rush to join in the fight.
Soon, innocent bystanders call out for their neighbors to grab their clubs, bills, and partisans to come and break up the fight.
Even the heads of the two households show up with their old-fashioned longswords and threaten to join in.
This is getting a little out of hand, isn't it, Ralph?
It sure is, Sarah. And we soon learn that this is the third time in recent days that fighting between these two families has broken out on the city streets.
It may seem strange to a modern audience that Shakespeare has described Verona, a sophisticated city in northern Italy, as a virtual armed camp where street fighting is a common occurrence.
But would it have seemed strange to Shakespeare's Renaissance audience? To answer that question, let's take a quick look back at violence in European history.
About 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire was at its peak and incorporated much of Europe. This period is often referred to as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, due to the stability brought about by effective government administration enforced by the highly professional legions of the Roman army.
But when barbaric tribes from the north invaded during the 5th century, the Roman Empire collapsed, removing its stabilizing influence. As a result, during the 10 centuries that followed, known as the medieval period or the Middle Ages, there was an increase in violent conflicts between clans, tribes, and local lords.
Even today, when traveling through the European countryside, one is constantly reminded how violent this period was. Practically every medieval village is situated on the top of a steep hill or perched on a cliff to take advantage of these natural defenses. And the remnants of the high protective walls which once surrounded even the smallest of villages are clearly evident.
Whenever strong rulers emerged during this time, they attempted to curtail civil violence by keeping their nobles from fighting one another, and by enforcing severe punishment for public fighting.
An example of this can be seen in Romeo and Juliet when the angry Prince of Verona announces that any further fighting between the Capulets and Montagues will be punished by death.
In England, the monarchy gradually increased in size and power, so that by the time of Queen Elizabeth, the government had become an authoritarian regime controlling many aspects of public society and was successful in curbing civil violence.
Shakespeare, for example, certainly didn't need to carry a sword when he walked around London.
But the same could not be said of Italy. It had remained divided into a number of independent city-states who constantly waged war with each other, with the Pope, and with the Holy Roman Emperor, who was constantly trying to reestablish the empire of the Caesars.
In the absence of a supreme authority, rivalries between competing political factions sometimes turned violent. For example, the great cultural center of Florence was torn apart by 50 years of civil strife when its two most powerful families fought for control of the city.
So you can see that Shakespeare's violent depiction of Verona would have corresponded well with his audience's image of a typical medieval Italian city.
And there's another, more personal form of violence depicted in Romeo and Juliet, one that also emerged during the late Middle Ages, the duel.
In these societies, with their rigid class structures, a nobleman might take offense at some perceived insult and demand one-on-one combat to restore his honor.
There's an example of this in Romeo and Juliet when the Capulet nobleman Tybalt, offended that Romeo, a Montague, crashed his uncle's party, sends him a formal challenge to a duel.
But Romeo and Juliet takes place in Verona, not England, where dueling, like all other forms of public violence, had been strictly outlawed for almost a century.
That's true, Ralph, but even though duels were almost unheard of in the England of Shakespeare's time, young English noblemen were still very keen to master the art of fencing and to keep abreast of the latest dueling protocols.
And duels, like everything else in upper-class society, were formal affairs governed by an intricate code of behavior.
But all of this fencing skill was more a matter of social fashion than of practical value, since none of them were likely to ever draw their sword in anger.
In a throwback to the mythical era of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, when noblemen viewed themselves as chivalrous warriors, The young, status-conscious, testosterone-charged English gentlemen in Shakespeare's audience measured themselves against each other with the skills of fencing and all of the trappings of the duel.
The top fencing coaches were highly sought after, and their latest dueling manuals read and discussed. Young men spent countless hours refining the grace of their fencing style and debating the code of honor for such duels.
But as we've said, these duels generally never happened, and therefore all this elaborate talk and preparation must have seemed a little silly. Mercutio mocks Tybalt for being one of these young men.
That's right, Ralph. He says that Tybalt fights as you sing a song, 1, 2, and the third in your bosom, and that Tybalt is just trying to impress everyone with his mastery of the latest fencing maneuvers. The passado, the punto, the reverso, the high.
Finally, Mercutio makes fun of Tybalt by calling him the very butcher of a silk button. This is a reference to the most famous fencer of Shakespeare's day, who boasted that he could stab his opponent in whichever shirt button he chose.
But Shakespeare's play is above all a love story about two teenagers from rival families who secretly fall in love and get married, with tragic consequences.
So to fully appreciate this play, it's also helpful to understand the attitudes and customs of Shakespeare's day regarding marriage, romance, and courtship.
Good point, Ralph. Some of their ideas about love certainly seem different from the ideas we have today.
What did you have in mind, Sarah?
Well, I was certainly surprised when Paris shows up to talk to Lord Capulet about marrying his daughter Juliet, even though he's never met her.
I see what you mean. Though that's not nearly as surprising as when Capulet says she hath not seen the change of 14 years.
Wait, so Juliet is only 13?
Well, that's right. And that's why Capulet suggests that Paris wait a couple of years before pursuing the marriage. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we may think her ripe to be a bride.
So what's going on here, Ralph? Were their views of marriage really that different from ours?
Well, among the nobility, they certainly were. Marriages between noble families were motivated by the financial, political, and even military implications much more than they were by love.
Ah, I see. So Paris wants to marry Juliet in order to form an alliance with the Capulets. That's why it doesn't matter much that he hasn't met her.
That's right. And it's an alliance that would be good for both families. Paris is a relative of the prince, after all. So Lord Capulet would like the alliance too. But because his daughter is so young, he thinks it would be better to wait a couple of summers when she's older.
I see. If marriage alliances are so important, then young people having their own ideas about who to marry could cause some real conflict.
Exactly. The problem with Romeo and Juliet falling in love, from the perspective of their families, is that it would prevent the families from choosing alliances. And of course, because it ignores the family feud between the Montagues and the Capulets. The Montagues and the Capulets hate each other. An alliance is the last thing they want.
That's interesting. Now I understand what the friar is up to. He's hoping their marriage will create an alliance of a different kind, one that will overcome the decades of violence between the families. For this alliance may so happy prove to turn your household's rancor to pure love.
Yes, well, spoiler alert, the families do learn to love each other, but with a lot of tragedy in the process.
And so what about Juliet's age? Is that part weird, even for them?
Well, if they had been from working-class families, getting married at such a young age would have seemed rash. Young adults of the working class usually didn't get married until they could support themselves, usually in their mid-20s. With Paris and Juliet, the alliance is the most important factor, but 13 is still really young, and Capulet thinks it's best to wait.
Okay, well, it's pretty clear that Elizabethans thought about marriage differently than we do. But what about love? Isn't the love story between Romeo and Juliet pretty familiar to us?
Good question, Sarah. And to answer that question, let's remind our audience how the play starts.
When the play opens, Romeo is in the depths of despair. He can't sleep, has no appetite, and just wanders around alone, emitting deep sighs of woe. All because he's hopelessly in love with a woman he can never have.
But the woman isn't Juliet. It's her cousin, Rosaline, who has made a vow of chastity.
It seems strange that Romeo could be so passionately in love with Rosaline. She's a Capulet, which means he hardly knows her.
And the one thing he would know is that the vow that she's made means she could never marry.
But couldn't Rosaline just change her mind about the whole chastity business?
Not really. A vow of chastity was a vow to God and a promise about the rest of one's life. Breaking a contract with God would be a mortal sin.
Wow, so he really is in love with someone he can never be with.
Yes, but for Shakespeare, that's part of the point.
What do you mean?
Well, part of what Shakespeare's drawing on is a relatively new way of thinking about romantic love. And to understand that, we need to go back 250 years before Shakespeare's day to the city of Avignon in southern France.
Due to a power struggle inside the Catholic Church, a rebellious faction set up its own pope in Avignon, far from Roman control.
Serving as an administrator in this breakaway church was a young Italian nobleman named Francesco Petrarca. But Petrarch, as he's referred to today, wasn't interested in church bureaucracy.
His real passion was literature, and life in Avignon exposed him to a type of popular fiction that could best be described as a combination of adventure story and romance novel.
These chivalric romances, as they were called, often dealt with legends like King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. A typical plot featured a chivalrous knight performing acts of bravery to impress a virtuous maiden.
These tales represent the most noble form of love as expressed by a knight who devotes his life to the service of a maiden, all the while suffering her rejection.
One day, sitting in a church service in Avignon, Petrarch became enamored of a beautiful woman, though it quickly became apparent that he could not hope to have a relationship with her.
Nonetheless, over the next 40 years, Petrarch chronicled his turbulent emotions for the magnificent Laura in a series of 366 elegant love poems.
It's possible that Petrarch was truly a real-life incarnation of a knight from chivalric romance, spending his entire life idolizing a woman with whom he had little, if any, contact.
But it's more likely that Petrarch used this one episode in the church as the basis for a fictional narrative in which he could display his literary skills and expound on the subject of romantic feelings.
Either way, Petrarch and his poetry became a really big deal. Petrarch's work not only defined the conventions of love poetry prevalent in Shakespeare's day, but also determined how London society perceived noble love.
When Petrarch described the profound despair resulting from his unrequited love for Laura, he was giving voice for the first time to the full range of human emotions about love. And this is one of the reasons that he is referred to as the father of humanism.
But that alone doesn't explain his widespread influence. In 1458, the invention of the printing press sparked an information revolution, as mass-produced books replaced hand-copied manuscripts.
By Shakespeare's birth a century later, 200 million books had been printed in Europe, and literacy rates soared.
For the first time in history, popular writers reached a large enough readership that they could affect a society's attitudes.
And it was just such attitudes towards courtly love, adopted by English society from the literature of Petrarch and later writers, which Shakespeare portrays in the first half of Romeo and Juliet.
Romeo resembles a character straight out of chivalric romance, doomed to a life of noble suffering because of his everlasting love for the unattainable Rosaline, who has pledged a vow of chastity.
Romeo's behavior, lack of appetite, sleeplessness, wandering alone, constantly emitting deep sighs, is typical of the Petrarchan rejected lover, and he's mocked by the other characters in the play for it.
Just as Mercutio makes fun of Tybalt for posing as the noble warrior, he also ridicules Romeo for acting the role of the suffering lover.
Why, is not this better now than groaning for love?
So there you have it, Sarah. A little insight into the nature of love and war in Shakespeare's day that should help us understand and enjoy the play itself.
Indeed, and a good reminder that, even though this play is famous for its two lovers, the role of violence and hatred are just as important to the plot. In fact, it reminds me of the opening lines of the play itself. Shall we get folks started on the play by reading those lines now?
Sure, I'll start. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene.
From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean.
From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life.
Whose misadventured piteous overthrows do with their death bury their parents' strife.